The heat was the first thing. Not a greeting, not a welcome, but a hand pressed flat against her chest the moment she stepped off the train, pushing her back, daring her to stay. Clara Wynn gripped the iron railing and held on 1 second longer than she needed to. The metal was hot enough to sting. She did not let go because of the heat. She let go because there was nowhere left to go but forward. The platform at Copper Springs was nothing more than weathered planks and a single bench bleached white by the sun. A water barrel sat near the depot office with a tin dipper hanging from a nail. Beyond the station the town baked in the afternoon glare. False-fronted buildings, a church steeple so white against the brown hills it hurt to look at, horses standing with their heads low at hitching posts too hot to swat the flies that gathered at their eyes. Clara stepped down. Her left foot hit the platform first solid and sure, then her right, then her left again, and this time the old ache flared through her hip and radiated down through the bone that had never healed straight. 18 years since the fall. She had been 9 years old, standing on the third rung of the hayloft ladder in her father's barn in Chillicothe, Ohio, when the wood cracked beneath her shoe and sent her tumbling 8 feet onto a stone floor. The bone in her left thigh had shattered in 3 places. Doc Prentice had set it as best he could, but the leg grew back crooked, shorter than the right by nearly an inch, and she had walked with a rolling, uneven gait ever since. She had learned to make it look purposeful, steady, like a woman who knew where she was going and did not care how long it took to get there. She set her trunk down on the platform and reached into the pocket of her dress. The daguerreotype was warm from the heat of her body. She studied it again, though she had memorized every detail months ago. A stout man with a handlebar mustache standing stiff-backed beside a wagon. Brown vest, hard eyes. The kind of face that looked like it had been carved from the same wood as a fence post. Harlan Briggs, owner of Briggs General Mercantile, the man whose letters had arrived in Ohio every month for 8 months. 23 letters in all. She had kept every one, had read them so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds and the ink had begun to blur where her thumb pressed against the words she wanted most to believe. He had written that he needed a wife who could work hard and keep a home, that he did not care about beauty or fine manners, that he wanted a partner plain and simple. He had written that the sunsets in Arizona looked like God had spilled his paint box across the sky. He had written that he was lonely, and the word had landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water because she knew that word. She had lived inside that word her entire life. She had written back that she was plain, that she could cook and clean and mend, that she had nursed her grandmother through 2 winters of fever and sat beside her when the Lord finally called her home, that she was not afraid of hard work and never had been. She had not mentioned her leg. Her mother had called it a sin of omission. Had stood in the kitchen doorway with flour on her hands and disappointment on her face and said, "You are lying to that man, Clara, lying by what you leave out." Clara had called it survival, because she knew with the certainty of 18 years of evidence what happened when people saw the leg first. They stopped seeing everything else. She became the limp and nothing more. The girl who walked funny. The woman no one wanted to dance with. The daughter no man had ever come courting for, not once, not even the widower Teague, who was 63 and missing most of his teeth, and would have married a fence post if it could fry an egg. She had told herself that if Harlan Briggs could see her face first, hear her voice first, know her first, then the leg would not matter. That a man who wrote about loneliness and sunsets would understand that a crooked bone did not make a crooked heart. She had been wrong. Clara scanned the faces on the platform, and there he was, standing beside a buckboard at the edge of the station. Brown vest, sun, weathered face hat pushed back on his forehead. Exactly like the photograph, except older, heavier, the mustache waxed to sharp points that caught the light. He was watching the passengers step down. His eyes moved past a family with 2 small children, past a drummer in a checkered suit hauling a sample case, past an elderly woman clutching a carpet bag. They found Clara. She raised her hand, a small wave, half greeting, half plea. She took a step forward. The moment her weight shifted to her left leg, his face changed. It was not disappointment. She had seen disappointment before and knew its shape. This was something else. A tightening around the mouth, a narrowing of the eyes. His gaze dropped to her feet and stayed there watching as she took another step and another. The uneven rhythm unmistakable. Left foot, left foot. The slight dip, the slight delay. The body compensating for what could not be fixed. Clara kept walking. Her heart threw itself against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she kept her chin up and her pace steady. 10 feet away. 8 feet. 6. He shook his head. Just once. A small motion definitive like a man closing a book he had no intention of finishing. Then he turned, climbed onto the buckboard, snapped the reins, and the wagon pulled away without a word. Not one word. Clara stood in the settling dust. Her hand was still half raised in a wave that had nowhere to land. The wheels creaked. The horse's hooves struck the packed earth in a rhythm that faded and faded and faded until the buckboard turned the corner behind the livery stable and was gone. She lowered her hand. Her fingers were trembling. She pressed them flat against the front of her skirt and held them there until they stopped. Around her the platform had mostly cleared. The family with children was loading into a hired hack. The drummer was arguing with a porter over the price of hauling his case. The elderly woman had disappeared into the depot office. Clara stood alone with her trunk. The sun beat down on her bonnet. Sweat ran down the back of her neck and soaked into the collar of her best dress. Faded blue calico mended at the elbow pressed that morning with a sad iron she had borrowed from her landlady in Chillicothe. The nicest thing she owned. She had worn it to make a good impression. A fly circled her ear. She did not swat it away. "Ma'am." The voice came from behind her. She turned to find a man in a railroad cap, elderly, his face creased like a map that had been folded too many times. His name tag read, E. Pruitt, the station master. "Ma'am, you got folks coming for you." Clara looked at him. Then she looked at the empty street where the buckboard had vanished. Then she sat down on her trunk, removed her bonnet, and fanned herself slowly with it. The motion gave her hands something to do. "Not any more," she said. "I reckon not any more." Pruitt shifted his weight. He glanced down at her leg, then quickly away, and she knew he understood exactly what had happened. Men like Pruitt had been watching the world long enough to recognize its cruelties without needing them explained. "That was Harlan Briggs's wagon, wasn't it?" It was. "And you're the lady he sent for, from back east." "Ohio." She kept fanning. The air she moved was hot and smelled of creosote and horse manure and dust, but moving it was better than holding still. "I'm the lady he sent for," she said, "and I'm the lady he decided he didn't want, after all." Pruitt's mouth pressed into a thin line. He glanced down the street one more time as if the buckboard might reappear, as if Briggs might come to his senses and turn around. The street stayed empty. "That ain't right," he muttered. "Man ought to at least say something. Ought to at least have the decency to—" "It's done." Clara's voice came out flat. Not because she felt nothing, but because she could not afford to feel anything. Anger required energy, and energy required money, and money was the one thing she had almost none of. "Is there a boarding house in town? Somewhere respectable?" "Widow Harmon takes boarders. 50 cents a night, meals included. Good woman, keeps a clean house." Clara reached into the small drawstring purse tucked inside her sleeve. She counted the coins by touch. She did not need to look. She had counted them on the train. Had counted them again when the train stopped for water in Tucson, had counted them a third time this morning before dawn, while the other passengers slept and the desert rolled past the darkened windows. $2.37. Everything she had left in the world. 4 nights at 50 cents would leave her with 37 cents. 4 nights to figure out what came next. 4 nights before she was sleeping on the ground. Where would I find Mrs. Harmon? Pruitt pointed down the main street. "Third house past the Mercantile. Yellow shutters. Can't miss it." Clara stood tucking the purse back into her sleeve. She bent to grip the rope handle of her trunk, then paused. "Mr. Pruitt, Is there work to be had around here for a woman?" He scratched his jaw. His nails rasped against gray stubble. "The hotel might need kitchen help. Pays not much, but it's steady." He hesitated. "There's a place about 2 miles out, the Holloway Ranch. Man, there's been poorly since the dust storm hit back in spring. His hands quit on him. Doc stopped making visits." He shook his head slowly. "But that's hard country for a woman alone, and Holloway, well, he ain't got much to pay with neither." Clara looked out past the edge of town, where the land rose into brown hills dotted with scrub. 2 miles on her leg in this heat. Carrying a trunk. Impossible. But then again, so was everything else. Everything had been impossible since the morning she mailed the first letter to Arizona. Since the morning she decided to bet her entire life on the kindness of a stranger she had never met. "Thank you," she said. "I'll think on it." She lifted her trunk. It was heavier than she remembered, or maybe she was just tired. Tired from 3 days on the train. Tired from a lifetime of walking into rooms and watching people's eyes drop to her feet. She began the slow walk toward the yellow shutters. Behind her, Pruitt called out, "Ma'am, what Briggs did, that ain't how most folks are. You remember that?" Clara did not turn around. She just kept walking. The boarding house was clean and quiet and smelled of lye soap and boiled potatoes. Mrs. Harmon was a broad woman with kind eyes who asked no questions and showed Clara to a room at the back of the house. A narrow bed, a washstand with a chipped basin, a window that looked out onto a patch of dirt where 3 chickens scratched in the shade of a mesquite tree. Clara set her trunk at the foot of the bed and sat down on the mattress. The springs groaned beneath her weight. She sat there for a long time without moving, her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall. Then she opened the trunk. Her things lay inside in the same order she had packed them 3 days ago in Ohio. Her spare dress, brown cotton, even more faded than the blue one she wore. Her brush, the bristles worn soft. Her grandmother's ivory comb, the teeth yellowed with age, the only beautiful thing she had ever owned. Her Bible, the leather binding cracked along the spine. And at the bottom, beneath everything else, a single envelope. Clara picked it up. The paper was cream-colored, soft with age. The handwriting on the front was her mother's. Careful, slanting letters that leaned to the right as if reaching for something just out of grasp. Her mother had given it to her the week before she died, had pressed it into Clara's hands with fingers that were already thin and cold, and said, "Not now, you'll know when." That had been 2 years ago. Clara had carried the letter across Ohio onto the train across 1,000 miles of prairie and desert and mountain. She had held it in the dark on sleepless nights and pressed it against her chest like a compress against a wound. She had turned it over in her hands 100 times, 1,000 times, running her thumb along the sealed edge where the gum had dried and cracked with age. She had never opened it. She did not know why, or perhaps she did know, and the knowing was the reason, because the letter was the last thing her mother had given her. And as long as it remained sealed, as long as the words inside stayed hidden, her mother was still speaking, still had something left to say. Opening it would make the silence permanent. Clara held the envelope for a moment. Then she placed it back at the bottom of the trunk, beneath the Bible, beneath the brush, beneath everything. Not yet. She closed the trunk. She lay back on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling. A crack ran across the plaster from one corner to the other, thin as a hair. She traced it with her eyes the way she used to trace the roads on her father's map of America, following the lines west, always west toward places she had never been and would probably never see. Outside, the sun was going down. The light in the room turned from white to gold to copper. The chickens had gone quiet. Somewhere down the street a dog barked once and then stopped as if it had forgotten what it was barking at. Clara pressed her palm against her left thigh. The bone beneath the muscle was warm and ached with the particular stubbornness of something that had been broken and put back together wrong. She had carried this ache for 18 years, had built her life around it, the way a river builds its course around a stone, finding a new path, a slower path, but never stopping. Tomorrow she would ask about work at the hotel, and if the hotel had nothing, she would ask somewhere else. And if no one in this town would hire a woman with a bad leg and no references and no husband, then she would walk 2 miles into the desert and knock on a stranger's door and offer him the only thing she had left. Her hands, her stubbornness, her refusal to lie down and let the world roll over her. She closed her eyes. In the darkness behind her lids, she saw the buckboard pulling away. She saw Harlan Briggs' face the way it had changed, the disgust that had moved across it like a shadow crossing open ground. She saw the dust settling on the platform. She saw her own hand still raised, still waving at a man who was already gone. She let the image stay, let it burn. Then she folded it up and put it away in the same place she kept all the other hurts, the place deep inside her chest where things went when they were too heavy to carry and too stubborn to throw away. Tomorrow. Everything would begin tomorrow. She set out before dawn. The sky was still bruised with night when Clara stepped off the boarding house porch, her canteen full, her bonnet tied tight, and nothing else on her person except the directions Emmett Pruitt had scratched onto a scrap of paper the evening before. 2 miles south, past the cemetery, past the dry creek bed. Look for a windmill with a broken blade. She had left her trunk at Mrs. Harmon's, had paid for one more night. That left her with $1.37, and the arithmetic of it sat in her stomach like a swallowed stone. 2 more nights, maybe 3 if she skipped a meal. After that the numbers ran out, and so did she. The road out of Copper Springs was not a road at all, but a pair of wagon ruts pressed into the hard earth already crumbling at the edges where the summer heat had baked the clay to powder. Scrub brush lined both sides, mesquite and creosote and something low and thorny she did not recognize. The air smelled of dust and sage and the faint mineral sharpness of rock that had been baking under the sun for 1,000 years. Clara walked. Her left leg found its rhythm. Step, dip, step, step, dip, step. The ache started in her hip and worked its way down through the crooked bone settling behind her knee, where it pulsed with each footfall like a second heartbeat. She had walked through worse, had walked through Ohio winters when the cold turned the ache into something electric, something that crackled through her bones like lightning trapped in a jar. This was just heat, heat she could manage. The sun crested the hills to her east, and the temperature climbed with it. By the time she passed the cemetery, a small fenced square of wooden crosses and stone markers huddled together on a low rise, the sweat had soaked through the back of her dress and plastered the fabric to her skin. She stopped in the thin shade of a mesquite tree, uncapped her canteen, and allowed herself 3 swallows. No more. She did not know if there would be water at the other end. She rested for 5 minutes. Then she stood and kept walking. The dry creek bed came next, a shallow channel carved into the earth. The banks cracked and pale, the bottom littered with smooth stones that had not known water in months. She crossed it carefully, testing each step on the uneven ground, her left ankle rolling once on a loose rock before she caught herself. And then she saw the windmill. It rose above the scrub like a skeleton, the metal frame rusted, one blade missing from the wheel, so that it turned in a lopsided, limping circle. The sound it made was thin and sad, a rhythmic creak that sounded like a rocking chair on a porch where no one sat anymore. Beyond the windmill, the ranch spread out before her. Clara stopped walking. She stood at the edge of the property and looked, and what she saw made her stomach tighten into a fist. The house sagged. There was no other word for it. The whole structure leaned slightly to the south, as if it had grown tired of standing upright and was in the process of giving up. Shutters hung crooked on rusted hinges. The front porch dipped in the middle where a support beam had bowed. Paint once white had peeled back in long curling strips that hung from the clapboards like dead skin. A vegetable garden sprawled beside the house, bordered by a fence that was more gap than fence. Weeds had swallowed most of it. Vineweed and pigweed and something with thorns that climbed over everything else. But underneath the tangle she could see color. The yellow of late squash, the deep red of tomatoes gone wild on their vines, split and oozing in the heat. Not dead, just forgotten. In the corral a bay mare stood with her head low, her ribs pressed against a dull coat. Flies clustered at her eyes, and she did not twitch them away. Beyond the corral, a chicken coop leaned at an angle that defied the basic principles of standing. Chickens wandered in and out through gaps in the boards, scratching in the dirt, utterly indifferent to the state of everything around them. No smoke from the chimney. No sound but the windmill and the chickens and the dry, hot wind that moved through the scrub like something searching for water. Clara wiped the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. She looked at the house, looked at the sagging porch and the crooked shutters, and the garden drowning in weeds. She looked at the mare standing in the corral with her head down, waiting for someone who had stopped coming. Then she walked toward the front door. Her knock echoed through the house and came back hollow. She waited, knocked again. The door swung inward on its own, the hinges groaning like an old man turning over in his sleep. The smell hit her first. Sour, thick, wrong. The smell of sickness trapped in a room where no window had been opened in weeks. Sweat and something underneath the sweat, something sweet and rotten that coated the back of her throat and made her eyes water. She knew that smell. Her grandmother had taught her to recognize it during the long winters when Clara had helped tend the sick and the dying in their small Ohio town. The old woman had called it the smell of a body turning against itself. Clara pressed her hand over her nose and mouth and stepped inside. The room was dim, curtains drawn. The only light came through the open door behind her, and through the cracks between the shutters where thin blades of sun cut across the dusty air. A table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A cold stove against the wall, dead ashes spilling from its grate. Shelves lined with jars and tins. A sampler hanging on the wall near the window, the stitching faded but still legible. Margaret Holloway, 1879. And against the far wall, a cot. A man lay on it. He was maybe 30, maybe older. Hard to tell with his face slack and gray and sheened with sweat, dark hair plastered to his forehead. Several days of beard on his jaw, the stubble patchy and uneven. His shirt was soaked through the fabric clinging to his chest with every shallow breath, and his breathing was the only sound in the room, a thin, ragged whistle that came and went like wind through a cracked window. His left arm lay across his stomach, wrapped in rags that had once been white and were now the color of old tea stained through with something darker. The smell was coming from there, from the arm, from whatever was underneath those rags. Clara crossed the room. Her fingers found his forehead, and the heat that came off his skin shocked her. Not the heat of fever, the heat of something burning from the inside, consuming itself. She had felt skin this hot only once before, on the night her grandmother had laid her hands on Walter Meacham's forehead and turned to Clara and said quietly so Walter would not hear, "Go fetch the preacher." She peeled back the edge of the bandage. Slowly. The fabric stuck to the wound, and she had to work it loose, the dried blood and pus creating a seal that crackled when it broke. The smell sharpened, rising out of the opened wound like something that had been held down and finally set free. His forearm was swollen tight, the skin stretched and shining the color of a plum gone bad. The wound itself was a gash across the meat of the arm, maybe 4 inches long, deep enough that she could see the white of tissue beneath the red. The edges were puffy and weeping yellow fluid, and the red lines, thin as spider silk, crawling up from the wound past his wrist, climbing toward his elbow in delicate branching patterns that looked almost beautiful if you did not know what they meant. Clara knew what they meant. Her grandmother's voice, steady and factual, echoed through the years. The creeping death child, blood poisoning. Once those red lines reach the heart, there's nothing to be done. Not by you, not by me, not by any doctor God ever made. The lines had reached his mid-forearm. His elbow was maybe 4 inches away. From the elbow, the poison would travel fast, racing through the larger vessels toward the shoulder, the chest, the heart. 2 miles back to town. 2 hours at least, probably 3 on her leg in this heat. By the time she found the doctor, if there was a doctor willing to come, and brought him back, this man would be dead. The arithmetic was as simple and brutal as the arithmetic of her coins. The numbers did not lie. The numbers never lied. Clara looked at his face. His cracked lips moved, forming words she could not hear. Fragments of speech carried on breath that barely had the strength to leave his body. She leaned closer. "Margaret. The cattle. The gate's open. Margaret." She straightened up. She could walk away, could turn around and close the door behind her and walk back to Copper Springs and tell Emmett Pruitt that the man at the Holloway Ranch was beyond help. No one would blame her. No one would even know she had been here. Clara looked at the door, looked at the rectangle of white sunlight falling across the threshold, the world outside bright and open, and offering her nothing but the long walk back to a borrowed room and $1.37. She looked at the man on the cot. Then she went to find the well. The pump was behind the house. It groaned when she worked the handle, a deep metallic complaint that sounded like something that had not been asked to move in a long time. She pumped harder. The pipe coughed. Rust-colored water spat into the dirt, then ran brown, then slowly, reluctantly ran clear. She filled the basin she found inside and carried it to the kitchen. Her leg throbbed with every step. She ignored it. The stove was cold, the firebox full of dead ash. She scraped it out with her bare hands, the ash silky and gray between her fingers, and found kindling in a box beside the hearth. A match from the tin on the mantel. The sulfur flared. The wood caught. She fed the fire carefully, building it from nothing, the way her grandmother had taught her, the way she had done 1,000 mornings in Ohio. Small sticks first, then larger ones. Patient, steady. Do not rush the flame or it will die on you. She set the basin on the stove to heat. The man on the cot had not moved. His breathing had not changed. The shallow whistle in and out, the sound of lungs working on nothing but habit. Clara searched the kitchen. A cracked bar of lye soap on the washstand. A bottle of whiskey in the cupboard, half empty, the label peeled and stained. Clean rags. She found none. She looked around the room, looked down at herself. Her petticoat was white cotton. Her mother had hemmed it the week before Clara left Ohio. Her mother's last piece of needlework. The stitches small and even along the edge, the kind of stitches that came from 40 years of practice and hands that still remembered how to be precise even when the body was failing. Clara found a paring knife in a drawer, tested the edge against her thumb. Sharp enough. She lifted her skirt and began to cut. The fabric tore in long strips. She folded them and set them beside the heating water. Then she turned back to the cot. His arm first. She had to see what she was dealing with. The old bandages came away in pieces. Each section had to be soaked with warm water before it would release its hold on the wound, the dried fluid softening and loosening as the cloth grew heavy and wet. She worked slowly, patiently, the way her grandmother had worked. "Rushing is for people who don't care about the outcome," the old woman used to say. "We are not those people." The man groaned but did not wake. His head turned on the pillow. His lips moved around the same word over and over. Margaret. Margaret. When the last of the bandages came free, Clara sat back and studied the wound in the light that filtered through the cracks in the shutters. The gash was ugly, ragged at the edges as if the skin had been torn rather than cut. Wire, she thought. Barbed wire. She had seen wounds like this on farmers in Ohio, men who had caught themselves on fencing while mending a line in the rain. But those men had cleaned their wounds the same day, had poured whiskey on the cut and wrapped it in clean cloth and gone on working. This wound had not been cleaned in weeks. The infection had taken root deep in the tissue and was spreading outward through the blood. She dipped a clean strip of petticoat into the hot water, added soap, wrung it once. Then she began to scrub. He screamed. The sound tore out of him like something that had been buried alive and was clawing its way to the surface. His good arm swung up wild and blind and caught Clara across the cheek. The impact snapped her head sideways. The basin flew from the edge of the cot where she had balanced it, water splashing across the floor in a wide arc. She stumbled backward, her hip striking the edge of the table, pain radiating through her pelvis and down into her bad leg. For a moment they stared at each other. She, standing one hand pressed to her stinging face, breathing hard. He half risen on the cot, his eyes unfocused and enormous with terror, the eyes of a man who did not know where he was or what year it was, or whether the hands touching him belonged to the living or the dead. "Margaret," he rasped. His voice was sand on glass. "Margaret, the cattle. The gate." "Hush now." Clara kept her voice low, steady, the way you speak to a horse that has spooked, or a child who has woken screaming from a dream they cannot escape. "Ain't no Margaret here, just me." His eyes searched her face, looked for something in it, and did not find it. Then the strength went out of him all at once like a rope cut, and he collapsed back onto the mattress, his chest heaving, his hand clutching the blanket beneath him. Clara stood very still. Her cheek burned where his fist had caught it. Her hip ached where it had struck the table. Her leg throbbed from standing on it for too long. She picked up the basin, refilled it, heated it again. This time, when she cleaned the wound, she pinned his good arm beneath her knee and held it there. The first day blurred into evening. She applied hot compresses to draw the infection out, pressing steaming cloths against the swollen flesh until they cooled, then heating them again over and over, the same motion repeated until her arms shook with fatigue. Her grandmother had taught her this, the slow, patient work of pulling poison from a body that did not want to let it go. No lancing, no cutting, just heat and pressure and time. When the worst of the pus had drained, she washed the wound again with soap and whiskey. He cursed, he thrashed, he called for Margaret in a voice that broke and broke and broke, but he did not fully wake. She wrapped his arm in clean strips of her petticoat and tied them firm. Then she brewed willow bark tea. There was bark in a jar on the shelf, dried and brittle, gathered by hands that were not here anymore. She steeped it until the water turned the color of weak coffee, bitter and earthy, and carried the cup to the cot. Getting the tea into him was harder than cleaning the wound. His jaw clenched. His head turned away. She cupped his chin with one hand and forced his mouth open with her thumb and poured in small sips the liquid running over his cracked lips and down his stubbled jaw. He choked, swallowed, choked again. Half the tea ended up on his shirt. Half went down his throat. It would have to be enough. Night fell. The kerosene lamp burned low. She found tallow candles in a drawer, lit two, set them on the table where their glow reached the cot. The man's fever climbed higher. His skin burned under her palm like a stove lid. Sweat soaked through the mattress and into the rope frame beneath. He muttered names she did not know. Margaret, always Margaret, and sometimes another name. Thomas or Tobias. She could not tell which. And then sometime deep in the second night, when the fever had climbed so high that his whole body shook, and she had soaked every rag she had in cool water and laid them across his forehead and chest and neck, and changed the bandages twice when yellow fluid seeped through, he said something else. He said it clearly, not mumbled, not buried in delirium. Clear the way a man speaks when he is standing at the edge of something and looking down. "Forgive me, Margaret. I should have been there. The fire. I left the door locked." Clara's hands stopped moving. Not fever, not sickness. Fire, and a locked door. She looked at his face, at the lines around his closed eyes, at the way his jaw clenched even in unconsciousness, the muscles tight, the teeth grinding against each other, as if he were trying to chew through something that could not be chewed through. She looked at his arm, at the wound she had spent hours cleaning, and she saw beneath the new injury, faint and smooth, a different kind of scar. Older. The skin puckered and shiny in the candlelight, the unmistakable texture of a burn that had healed long ago but never faded. Margaret had not died of fever. Clara did not know the full story. Did not know what fire or what door or why this man believed he needed forgiveness. But she understood something that required no explanation, something she recognized the way she recognized her own face in a mirror. This man was not dying of blood poisoning. The infection was killing his body. Yes, but something else had been killing him for much longer, something that no amount of willow bark tea could touch. She dipped a fresh cloth in warm water, wrung it out, laid it across his forehead. "I don't know who Margaret is," she said quietly, though he could not hear her. "And I don't know what you did or didn't do. But you ain't dying tonight. Not on my watch. You can hate yourself tomorrow if you want to, Tonight, you're going to live." She sat back in the chair. Her body ached in places she did not have names for. Her cheek was swollen where he had hit her. Her hands were raw from scrubbing. Her petticoat was in ribbons. Outside, the coyotes began to call. One voice, then another, then a chorus rising from the dark hills, into a sky so thick with stars it looked like someone had punched 1,000 holes in a black curtain and let the light pour through. Clara leaned forward, rested her hand on his good arm, and waited for morning. By the third dawn she had not slept more than an hour at a time. She sat slumped in the chair, her head tilted against the wall, her hand still resting on his arm. The candles had burned to nothing. The fire had gone to embers. The room smelled of ash and willow bark and the sharp, clean scent of whiskey. Then she felt it. The sudden cooling of his skin beneath her palm. The fever breaking not in a crash but in a slow, quiet retreat, like floodwater pulling back from a field. His sweat turned cool. The gray in his face softened, and beneath it faint as the first light of morning color returned. A flush across his cheekbones. A warmth that came from blood moving the way blood is supposed to move, carrying life instead of poison. Clara closed her eyes, just for a moment, just until she could find the strength to stand and check his bandages and heat more water and begin again. She woke to a voice. "Who are you?" Her eyes opened. Morning light filled the room, falling through the cracks in the shutters in long bright lines that striped the floor like bars on a cage. The man on the cot was watching her. His eyes were open, clear, sharp, and full of suspicion. Creek water eyes, she thought, gray-green and murky. The eyes of a man who had been looking at the world through pain for so long that he had forgotten there was any other way to see it. Clara straightened in the chair. Her neck screamed. Her back ached. Every muscle in her body felt like it had been wrung out and hung on a line to dry. She was too tired for cleverness, too tired for caution, too tired for anything except the truth. "Name's Clara," she said. "I was supposed to marry Harlan Briggs, but he didn't want me. Station master said you were out here dying. Seemed like somebody ought to check." She paused, looked at his arm, at the clean white bandages she had tied in the dark. "You ain't dead yet, so I reckon that's something." He stared at her. His mouth opened and closed. The words were there, but the shape of them would not come. "You're Briggs's woman. Was supposed to be." He took one look at my leg and changed his mind. A long silence. His eyes dropped to her feet, to her left leg stretched out in front of her at an angle that accommodated the ache. Then they came back to her face. "Briggs is a fool," he said. "That's what I figured, too." He tried to sit up. Gasped. His hand flew to his bandaged arm and his face went white as paper. Clara pressed him back down, her palm flat against his chest. She could feel his heart beating beneath her hand. Fast but steady. Alive. "Easy," she said. "You've been real sick. Blood poisoning. You're through the worst, but that arm's going to need tending for a good while yet." He lay back against the pillow. His eyes moved from her face to the bandages on his arm, studying the clean white strips wrapped firm around the wound. Something flickered across his expression. Not gratitude. Not yet. Confusion, maybe. The confusion of a man who had been ready to die and woke up to find that someone had made a different decision on his behalf. "Is that—" His voice cracked. He swallowed. Tried again. "Is that a petticoat?" "Was," Clara said. She smoothed down her skirt with both hands. "Seemed like you needed it more than I did." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the sampler on the wall. Margaret Holloway, 1879. And something in his face closed like a door shutting on a room he could not bear to enter. "My name's Silas," he said. "Silas Holloway." "Well, Silas Holloway." Clara pushed herself up from the chair. Every joint in her body protested. She ignored them all. "I'm going to make coffee, and you're going to drink it, and then we're going to figure out what happens next." She turned toward the stove. Behind her she heard him draw a breath, heard it catch in his throat, heard the silence that followed the silence of a man who wanted to say something and could not find the shape of it. She did not turn around. She just started building the fire. The days found their rhythm the way water finds a crack in stone, slowly, without announcement, following the path of least resistance until a channel forms and the current settles into something that feels, if not permanent, then at least dependable. Clara woke each morning before the light. She lay in the narrow bed in the room that had been Margaret's, staring at the ceiling where a water stain spread in the shape of something she could never quite name, and she listened to the house. The tick of the cooling stove, the creak of the cot in the main room as Silas shifted in his sleep, the chickens starting up outside their low murmuring conversation about nothing and everything the way chickens do. Then she rose, dressed in the dim light, pulled her hair back and pinned it without a mirror. She did not need a mirror. She had been pinning her hair the same way since she was 14, her fingers knowing the work, the way a pianist's fingers know the keys by feel, by memory, by repetition so deep it had become part of the body itself. She checked his bandages first. Each morning she unwound the strips of cotton and studied the wound beneath, watching the red lines retreat day by day, inch by inch, pulling back from the elbow like an army that had lost its nerve. The swelling faded, the angry color softened to pink, then to the pale, tender hue of new skin growing over old damage. She cleaned the wound, applied fresh cloths, rewrapped it, and said nothing about the older scars beneath. The burn marks, smooth and shiny and old. She saw them every morning, and every morning she kept her eyes on the new wound and let the old one be. Silas watched her work. He watched her the way a man watches a stranger in his house, with a wariness that had not yet decided whether to become trust or something harder. His eyes followed her hands as she unwound the bandages, followed her fingers as they tested the edges of the wound for heat, followed the movements of her body as she crossed the room to the stove, the basin, the shelf where the willow bark was kept. He watched the way she walked, the uneven cadence, the slight dip and rise, and he said nothing about it, not once, not a word. It was the kindest silence she had ever known. By the fourth day he could sit up on his own. He swung his legs off the cot and sat there for a long time, his good hand gripping the mattress edge, his chest heaving from the effort. Clara stood at the stove frying cornbread in bacon grease and did not offer to help. She had learned this about men, about people, that sometimes the most generous thing you could do was to look away while someone fought a battle they needed to win alone. By the sixth day he made it to the chair by the window. He lowered himself into it with the careful deliberation of a man twice his age, and he sat there looking out at the land, at the brown hills and the scrub and the corral, where the mare stood with her head finally lifted watching him back. Clara scrubbed the kitchen floor. The wood had gone gray with grime. Footprints tracked across it in patterns she could read the way her grandmother had taught her to read animal tracks in snow. From the door to the stove, from the stove to the cot. Nowhere else. The same path walked hundreds of times by a man who had stopped caring about anything beyond the minimum distance between where he slept and where he ate. She got down on her hands and knees with a brush and a bucket of soapy water, and she scrubbed. The bristles scraped against the boards. Dirty water pooled in the cracks between the planks, and she soaked it up with rags, wrung them into the bucket, and kept scrubbing. Her knees ached against the hard floor. Her left hip sent a current of pain down through her thigh with every forward push of the brush. She did not stop. "You don't have to do that." His voice came from the chair by the window. Quiet. Not quite a protest. More like a man stating a fact he knew would be ignored. She did not look up. "Floor's filthy." "Been filthy for months. Another day won't matter." "Matters to me." She heard him shift in the chair, heard the creak of wood against wood, but she did not hear him argue further. When she finally sat back on her heels and looked at what she had uncovered, the wood grain showed through, pale and clean, the color of honey held up to the light. She had forgotten that wood could look like this, that underneath the grime and the neglect and the months of a man walking the same path over and over without seeing what was beneath his feet, there was something worth finding. The windows came next. She washed them inside and out, standing on a crate to reach the top panes, the glass so coated with dust that she had to scrub twice before the light came through properly. When she finished, the afternoon sun fell across the clean floor in bright, warm squares, and the room looked like a place where someone might actually want to be alive. Silas watched from his chair. His expression gave nothing away. On the seventh day she found the garden. She had seen it from the outside, the tangle of weeds and wild growth behind the sagging fence, but she had not yet gone in. Now, with the house clean and the morning stretching ahead of her and nothing else demanding her hands, she pushed open the gate and stepped into the mess. It was worse than it looked from a distance. Vineweed had wrapped itself around everything, choking the tomato stakes, pulling down the bean poles, spreading in thick green ropes across the ground. Pigweed stood waist-high in the corners. The thorny plant she had seen from the road turned out to be some kind of wild gourd that had rooted itself in the center of what had once been a squash bed and taken over like a small angry kingdom. But underneath it all, life persisted. Tomatoes. Split and overripe, some of them already rotting on the vine, but others still holding on, their skins tight and red and warm from the sun. Yellow squash the size of her forearm, hidden beneath broad leaves that had curled brown at the edges. Onions with their green tops flopped sideways in the dirt, the bulbs firm when she pulled one free and brushed off the soil. Clara knelt in the dirt and began to pull weeds. The work was slow. Each vine had to be traced back to its root and pulled from the base, the tendrils unwinding from whatever they had claimed. The thorns drew blood from her fingers within minutes. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her spare dress and kept going. The sun climbed. Sweat ran down her temples and dripped from the point of her chin into the turned earth. Her legs screamed from crouching. She shifted her weight, knelt on her good knee, extended the bad leg behind her at an angle that eased the pull on the crooked bone. She worked until midday. Then she sat in the shade of the fence with her basket of salvaged vegetables and drank from her canteen and looked at what she had done. A cleared patch of earth, dark and rich and breathing. The soil here was better than she expected. Someone had worked this ground for years, had turned it and composted it and built it up layer by layer into something that could grow food even in this heat. Margaret's work, she thought. Like the mason jars on the shelves and the sampler on the wall and the curtains balled up in the corner, the evidence of a life lived carefully and thoroughly by hands that were no longer here. That evening she made soup, real soup, tomatoes and onions and squash simmered with salt and a pinch of pepper she found in a jar on the shelf. She served it in chipped bowls with cornbread on the side, the bread golden and steaming, the smell of it filling every corner of the house. Silas sat at the table. He had made it there on his own that afternoon, the first time he had sat in a chair that was not beside the cot or the window. Clara set the bowl in front of him and the plate of cornbread beside it, and turned back to the stove to serve her own portion. She heard him take a bite of the cornbread, heard the chewing stop. "When's the last time you ate something that wasn't cold beans?" she asked. She did not turn around. He did not answer right away. The silence had weight to it, the particular heaviness of a man confronting something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. "Can't recall," he said finally. "Well, that's about to change." She sat down across from him with her own bowl. She ate slowly, her eyes on her soup, giving him the same privacy she had given him every day since she arrived. The privacy of not being watched while you remembered what it meant to be cared for. But she heard him, heard the spoon against the bowl, heard him tear another piece of cornbread. And when she glanced up just once, just for a second, she saw him pressing the last crumbs against his fingertip and touching them to his tongue with his eyes closed, the way a man touches something holy, something he is afraid will disappear if he holds it too tightly. She looked away before he opened his eyes. On the 8th day he told her about Margaret. She had not asked. She had learned in the long, quiet hours of tending his wound and scrubbing his floors and pulling weeds from his garden that this man did not respond to questions. Questions made him retreat into himself like a turtle pulling into its shell, all the soft parts hidden, only the hard exterior showing. So she had stopped asking, had let the silence stretch between them like a rope with plenty of slack, giving him room to move at his own pace in his own time. They were sitting on the porch. She had dragged a chair out from the kitchen for him and claimed the top step for herself, her bad legs stretched out in front of her. The sun was going down. The sky was doing the thing it did every evening in Arizona, turning colors that seemed too extravagant to be real, like a painter who had been told he was dying and decided to use every pigment he had left. "My sister," he said. Clara turned her head slightly, just enough to show she was listening, not enough to make him feel watched. "Margaret was my sister." She waited. "She's the one who made that sampler. When she was 12, used to hang in our mother's kitchen back in Texas. When Ma died, Margaret took it with her." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." His voice was flat. The practiced flatness of a man who had said these words before and had learned to say them without letting anything escape. "Everybody dies. She just did it sooner than most." Clara looked out at the darkening hills. A coyote called from somewhere beyond the ridge, and a moment later another answered the two voices twining together in the dusk like threads of smoke. The silence settled between them, not empty, full. The way a room is full after a door has been opened and then closed again, the air still moving from the change in pressure. "That cornbread," Silas said. Clara waited. "My ma used to make it like that." "Everybody's ma made it like that. Ain't nothing special." "Didn't say it was special." A pause. She could feel him working up to something, turning a thought over the way you turn a stone in your hand, feeling for the smooth side. "Said it was good." She felt his eyes on her then, not on her face, lower, on her leg stretched out on the step, the shape of it visible beneath the fabric of her skirt. The left one, the crooked one, the one that had cost her a husband and a future and everything she had traveled 1,000 miles to find. "How'd it happen?" he asked. She could have deflected, could have changed the subject the way she had learned to do in Ohio when the staring went on too long or the questions got too personal. She had a dozen ways to redirect a conversation away from her leg. She had been practicing them for 18 years. But something in his voice stopped her, the same flatness he had used when talking about Margaret, the voice of a person who was not asking out of curiosity or pity, but out of recognition. One damaged thing looking at another and simply wanting to know. "Hayloft," she said. "I was 9. The ladder broke and I fell wrong. Shattered the bone in 3 places." She shrugged. The gesture felt small against the size of what it contained. "Doc said it best he could, but it never healed right. Grew up crooked." Silas nodded slowly. He did not say he was sorry. Did not offer sympathy or advice or any of the words people usually produced when they learned about her leg, words that were meant to help, but never did, because they always carried the same unspoken message beneath them. What a shame. What a waste. What a pity that you cannot be whole. He just nodded, like she had told him the weather. It was the kindest response she had ever received. They sat on the porch and watched the last light drain from the sky, and neither of them spoke again until the stars came out, and even then they did not speak. They just sat in the darkness together, two people who had learned that silence could be a room you shared with someone and that sharing it was enough. The curtains changed everything. Clara found them balled up in a corner of the back room, stuffed behind a trunk of men's clothing that smelled of cedar and dust. They had been white once, or maybe cream. Now they were gray with neglect and spotted with something that might have been grease or might have been mold or might have been both. She held them up to the light and studied them the way her grandmother had taught her to study fabric, looking for the strength still left in the weave, the life still hiding in the threads. She scrubbed them in the basin with lye soap and water so hot it turned her hands pink, wrung them out and hung them on the line behind the house where the afternoon wind could reach them. When they dried, she heated the sad iron on the stove and pressed them flat, working the wrinkles out section by section, the iron hissing against the damp cloth, steam rising in thin curls that caught the light. The curtains went back up in the kitchen window. The afternoon sun filtered through them, softer now, gentler, the light losing its sharp edge and landing on the clean floor in a warm, diffused glow that made the room look like a painting of a room, something an artist might compose to illustrate the word home. Silas stood in the doorway, watching. He had been leaning there for several minutes, she knew, because she had heard the floorboard creak beneath his weight when he shifted his stance. She had not turned around, had let him look at the curtains and whatever they stirred in him without the intrusion of her gaze. "Looks different," he said. "Looks like somebody lives here." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Clara turned from the window to face him. He stood with his good arm braced against the doorframe, his weight shifted to his right side, his eyes moving from the curtains to the clean floor, to the jars she had rearranged on the shelves, to the coffee pot sitting on the stove freshly brewed, sending a thin ribbon of steam into the air. "The dust storm hit 3 months back," he said. "Killed half my cattle. Rest scattered to the hills and I couldn't track them alone. Hands quit when I couldn't pay." He paused. His jaw worked. "I was out riding fence when the second storm came through. Horse spooked. Threw me into the wire. That's how I got the arm." Clara kept her eyes on his face. She did not look at the arm. "And then you just lay here," she said, "for 3 months. Wasn't 3 months. First month I could still work. 1 arm, but I managed. Second month the infection started. By the time it got bad—" He stopped. His eyes found the sampler on the wall. Margaret Holloway, 1879. "By then I figured it didn't matter much, one way or the other." Clara smoothed down her apron. Her hands were rough now. The knuckles cracked, the nails broken short, the skin across her palms thick with new calluses. Working hands. Her grandmother's hands. "You wanted to die," she said. Not a question. He did not answer. He did not have to. The answer was in the wound she had cleaned in the house he had let fall to ruin, in the way he had been lying on the floor of his own home with the door unlocked and no water within reach, waiting for the land to finish what the wire had started. "Well," Clara said, "I reckon it's a good thing I showed up when I did." She walked past him into the kitchen, her gait uneven, her chin high. Behind her she heard him draw a breath like he was about to speak. But when she glanced back, he was staring at the curtains, his hand still on the doorframe, his fingers pressing into the wood as if he needed it to hold him up. That night she found the root cellar. The door was hidden beneath a tangle of dead vines on the north side of the house, the wood swollen from old rains and warped in its frame. She pulled the vines away, lifted the heavy hatch, and descended the ladder into darkness. The air below was cool for the first time since she had arrived in Arizona. Cool and close, smelling of earth and preserves, and the faintly sweet scent of fruit sealed in glass. She struck a match. The flame trembled in the still air, throwing orange light across the earthen walls. Mason jars lined the shelves. Dozens of them, row after row of glass filled with color. Preserved tomatoes glowing red. Green beans standing upright in their brine like small soldiers at attention. Peaches in syrup, the flesh golden and soft, suspended in amber liquid that caught the matchlight and held it. Each jar was sealed with wax and labeled in a careful, feminine hand. Tomatoes, August 1882. Green beans, July 1881. Peaches, September 1880. Margaret's work, years of it. The patient harvest of a woman who had understood that abundance was temporary and winter always came even in Arizona, even in a place where the sun seemed permanent and the heat felt like it would never end. Clara moved along the shelves, her fingers trailing across the glass. She counted the jars. 37. Enough to feed 2 people for months if they were careful. Enough to carry them through the worst of what was coming if the crops failed and the money ran out and the town turned its back. She turned to go. And then she saw them. In the far corner, stacked against the wall where the earth was coolest, a pile of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. Clara crouched and lifted the bundle. The envelopes were soft with age, the corners rounded from handling. She tilted them toward the matchlight and read the return address on the top envelope. William Ashby, Lawrence, Kansas. She turned the envelope over. The front was addressed in the same careful hand that had labeled the mason jars. Margaret Holloway, Copper Springs, Arizona Territory. Letters from a man in Kansas to a woman who was no longer alive to read them. Or letters Margaret had written and never sent. Or replies she had kept after reading, stacking them in the coolest, darkest corner of the house, the way you store the things that matter most. Clara set the bundle down. These were not hers. She had no right to read them, no claim on the private correspondence of a dead woman she had never met. She turned to climb the ladder. Then she saw the second envelope. It had slipped from the bundle, or perhaps it had never been part of the bundle at all. It lay on the dirt floor beside the stack, half hidden in shadow, a different size than the others, a different color. Cream, where the Kansas letters were white. And the handwriting on the front was not Margaret's careful script. Clara recognized it instantly. The letters slanted to the right, each one leaning forward as if reaching for something just beyond its grasp. She knew this handwriting the way she knew the sound of her own breathing, had seen it on grocery lists and recipe cards and the margins of the family Bible and the envelope she carried in the bottom of her trunk, the envelope she had never opened, the last thing her mother had given her before she died. Her mother's handwriting, on a letter addressed to Margaret Holloway. Clara's hand shook as she picked it up. The envelope was unsealed, the flap tucked in rather than glued. She pulled it open and tilted the single page toward the dying match. The flame was burning low, the heat reaching her fingers, but she did not feel it. She read the first line, then the second. Then she stopped reading because the match burned out and the darkness swallowed everything. She stood in the black silence of the root cellar with the letter in her hand and her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She did not light another match. She did not need to. The words she had read were already inside her, already burning, already rearranging everything she thought she knew about why she was here and how she had come to be standing in a dead woman's cellar in a territory she had never planned to see. She climbed the ladder, tucked the letter into the pocket of her apron, closed the hatch, and walked back into the house where Silas was sitting in his chair by the window, whittling a piece of wood into something that might have been a spoon, his face lit by the kerosene lamp, his eyes lifting to meet hers as she came through the door. "Find anything down there?" he asked. "Preserves," she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Too steady, too controlled, like a rope pulled taut that might snap if you plucked it. "Your sister put up enough to last a year." That was Margaret, always planning for a winter that hadn't come yet. Clara nodded. She turned away from him toward the stove, toward the coffee pot, toward anything that would give her hands something to do and her face somewhere to hide. The letter in her apron pocket pressed against her hip like a coal that had not yet decided whether to go out or catch fire. She poured coffee, drank it without tasting it, and said nothing. The ride into town happened on a Tuesday. Silas had pressed the coins into her hand that morning, $3.40 counted out on the kitchen table in small, neat stacks. She had stared at them and understood what they represented. Everything. His last savings. The final distance between survival and surrender. "Take 2, she said, pushing the extra back across the table. "I don't need more than that." "Take it all. Get what you need." "I need flour and salt and coffee. That's $1, maybe less. Keep the rest." He had looked at her with something in his eyes she could not quite name. Not anger, not pride, something in between, the look of a man who was trying to give the only thing he had left and watching it be refused. She took $2, left the rest on the table, and rode Sadi into town before the argument could continue. The mercantile was cool after the brightness of the street. The smell of dried goods and pickle brine and penny candy filled her nose as she stepped through the door, the bell jingling overhead. She moved along the shelves with her list in her head. Flour, salt, coffee, bacon if the price was fair. The storekeeper was a thin man with spectacles who moved with the efficient indifference of someone who processed transactions rather than served people. He measured her goods without meeting her eyes. Flour in a sack, salt in a paper cone, coffee beans in a tin. His hands never paused. His face never changed. $1.12, he said. Clara counted out the coins. When her fingers brushed his palm, he pulled back as if she had touched him with something hot. She did not react. She had been pulled away from before, had learned to keep her face still when hands recoiled from hers, when eyes slid sideways, when bodies shifted to create distance they thought she would not notice. She gathered her goods and turned toward the door. 2 women stood near the fabric bolts at the back of the store. They had been watching her since she entered. Clara recognized one of them. gray hair pulled tight against her skull, a nose like the prow of a ship, a mouth that looked like it had been designed specifically for the purpose of saying unpleasant things. Mrs. Briggs, Harlan's mother. Clara had seen her portrait in one of the letters, seated in the center of a family gathering like a queen holding court. Their eyes met. Mrs. Briggs held Clara's gaze the way a snake holds the gaze of something small and warm. Then she turned to her companion and spoke in a voice pitched to carry across every inch of the store. Living out there alone with him. No ring on her finger and her limping around like that. She shook her head slowly, the gesture theatrical, rehearsed. Some women got no shame at all. The words crossed the store like a slap delivered from a distance. Clara's hand was resting on a bolt of calico blue, the color of the sky just before dusk. She had not meant to touch it, had not meant to linger, but her fingers had frozen against the fabric and she could not seem to command them to move. The companion murmured something. Mrs. Briggs laughed. A small sound, sharp-edged, the kind of laugh that is not about amusement but about dominance. Lord knows what she had to do to get him to take her in. Clara set the calico down. Her hands were steady. Her face was calm. She picked up her goods, tucked them under her arm, and walked to the door. The bell jingled as she pushed it open. The sunlight hit her face like a fist. She did not run. She did not cry. She walked to the hitching post, loaded her supplies into the saddlebags, and fumbled with the buckles until they closed. Her fingers were shaking. She could not make them stop. She gripped the leather strap and squeezed until the shaking became something she could contain, something she could press down into the place inside her chest where she kept the things that were too heavy to carry and too stubborn to put down. Miss. She turned. An elderly man in a leather apron stood behind her, his hands blackened with soot, his face creased by decades of forge heat. Tatum, the blacksmith. She had seen his shop at the end of the street, the glow of the furnace visible through the open doors, the rhythmic clang of his hammer carrying over the noise of the town. "Let me help you with that." He took the saddlebag from her hands, adjusted the straps, secured them against Sadi's flank, with the quiet competence of a man who had been handling horses and leather and heavy things for 50 years. His movements were unhurried, gentle, the movements of someone who understood that gentleness was not weakness but its opposite. "Name's Tatum," he said. "Knew Silas's daddy back in the day. Thomas Holloway. Good man. His son's cut from the same cloth. Good man. His son's cut from the same cloth." Clara did not trust herself to speak. Her throat was closed. Her eyes burned. She nodded. Tatum straightened up, brushed his hands against his apron. His eyes were kind, the kindness that comes not from innocence, but from having seen enough cruelty to recognize its opposite and choose it deliberately. "Don't let them get to you, miss. Small towns got small minds. Don't mean nothing." He paused. Something shifted in his expression, something careful and deliberate, like a man choosing his next words the way a carpenter chooses his next cut. "Mrs. Harmon knows where you are if there's trouble. She's good people." He nodded once. "You take care now." He walked back to his forge. The clang of his hammer started up again, steady and sure, the rhythm unchanged. The sound of a man doing his work, regardless of what the world around him chose to do with its time. Clara mounted Sadi and rode out of town. She did not cry on the ride home. She let Sadi set the pace, the mare's hooves finding their own rhythm on the hard-packed earth, the reins loose in Clara's hands. The sun pressed down on her shoulders. Dust coated her dress, her hands, her face. The land stretched out ahead of her, brown and endless, the hills rising and falling like the breathing of something ancient and indifferent. She thought about Mrs. Briggs, about the word shame spoken in a voice meant to be overheard, about the storekeeper's hand pulling away from hers, about all the small cruelties that accumulated over a lifetime until they formed a weight so familiar you forgot you were carrying it, until someone added one more piece and the whole structure threatened to collapse. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that crying changed nothing. It did not straighten her leg or soften the opinions of strangers or fill the empty place inside her chest where a different life might have lived if things had gone differently. So she did not cry. She just rode, and let the heat bake the hurt into something harder. But that night in the narrow bed in Margaret's room with the wool shawl pulled over her shoulders and the smell of lavender still clinging to its fibers, after all these years Clara pressed her face into the pillow and wept. She wept without sound, her body shaking, her hands gripping the fabric, her mouth open against the cotton. She wept for Ohio, for her grandmother, for the life she had been promised in careful handwriting on paper that wore thin at the folds. She wept for the word shameful and the storekeeper's recoiling hand, and the look on Mrs. Briggs's face, the cold, flat certainty of a woman who believed she had the right to decide what other women were worth. She wept until there was nothing left, until her body went still and her breathing slowed and the tears dried on her cheeks in the dark. And on the other side of the thin wall in the main room, lying on his cot with his eyes open and his hand pressed flat against the boards as if he could reach through them, Silas Holloway lay awake and listened to every sound she made. He did not move, did not knock, did not call out, but his hand curled into a fist against the wall, and his jaw tightened. And something in his eyes, if anyone had been there to see it, something that had been dead for a very long time, flickered and caught. Silas rode into town on a Wednesday morning. Clara had argued against it, had stood on the porch with her arms folded and her jaw set and told him his arm was not ready. The heat was too fierce. There was no reason he needed to go himself when she could make the ride just as well. He had not told her the real reason, had not said that he had lain awake for 3 nights listening to the sounds she made through the wall, the sounds she thought he could not hear, and that each night the fist against the boards had tightened until his nails left crescents in his palm. He had not said that something had shifted inside him, something tectonic and slow, the way the ground shifts before a quake, and that if he did not do something with the pressure building in his chest, it would crack him open from the inside. "I need seed," he said. "Can't plant without seed." "Then let me go." "No." The word came out harder than he intended. He saw her flinch, saw her eyes drop to the floor the way they did when she was hurt and trying not to show it. "I mean," he rubbed the back of his neck, "after what happened last time, the way they treated you. I won't have you going back there on my account." "It's not your account." Her voice was quiet. "It's ours." He did not know what to do with that word. Ours. It sat in the air between them like a stone thrown into a pond, the ripples spreading outward in circles he could not stop. So he saddled Sadi and rode out before the conversation could go any further. The feed store was dim and smelled of burlap and dried grain. Henley, the owner, looked up from behind the counter with the expression of a man who had just seen something he hoped would stay buried. "Holloway, didn't expect to see you up and about." "I need seed, corn and barley, enough for 10 acres. Henley moved along the shelves, pulling down sacks, weighing them on the scale with the slow deliberation of a man deciding how much truth to include in his next sentence. "Heard you got yourself some help out there. Woman from back east." "That's right. Folks are talking." "Folks can mind their own business." The door opened behind him. Silas did not turn, but he saw Henley's eyes shift toward the entrance, saw the careful rearrangement of his expression from uncomfortable to something worse. "Well, well." The voice filled the room the way smoke fills a closed space, spreading into every corner. "Look who finally crawled out of his hole." Silas turned. Harlan Briggs stood in the doorway, his bulk blocking the light. Clean shirt, polished boots. That mustache waxed to points sharp enough to hang a hat on. Behind him the street was bright and empty and offered no help. "Cobb." Silas caught himself. "Briggs." Briggs stepped inside, letting the door swing shut. The room shrank. "I was just telling my mother about you. She saw your woman in the mercantile the other day. Said she looked like something the cat dragged in." Silas said nothing. His hands hung loose at his sides. He could feel his pulse in his wrists, steady and hard, the beat of a drum counting down to something. "That lame woman's making a fool of you, Holloway." Briggs's voice dropped into the register men use when they want their words to sound like concern instead of cruelty. "Living out there alone with her. No ring, no proper arrangement. People are starting to wonder what kind of man you are." People can wonder all they want. Can they? Briggs took another step closer. He smelled of bay rum and tobacco and the particular arrogance of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Your daddy was a respected man in this town, built that ranch from nothing, and now his son's shacked up with some crippled cast-off letting the place fall to ruin. He shook his head slowly, the gesture designed to convey sadness, but landing somewhere closer to satisfaction. Send her back east where she belongs, before you lose whatever reputation you got left. The words hung in the air. Silas could feel the heat building behind his sternum, climbing into his throat, pressing against the backs of his teeth. He thought of Clara, of the sound of her crying through the wall, of the way she had come back from town with her face blank and her hands steady and something shattered behind her eyes that she thought she had hidden but had not from him, not anymore. You talk about reputation, Silas said. His voice was quiet, the quietness of deep water, of something with weight beneath the surface. You ordered a woman from Ohio, made her promises for 8 months, told her you wanted a partner, plain and simple, and then you took one look at her leg and left her standing on a train platform without saying a single word. Briggs's face went red. The color climbed from his collar to his forehead like a tide coming in. That's different. She lied to me. Didn't mention. She didn't lie. She just didn't think it mattered. Silas took a step forward. And it shouldn't have. But you looked at her leg and decided that was all she was. A limp. A thing to be ashamed of. He shook his head. The only fool I see in this room is you. Briggs' hands clenched. His jaw tightened. For a moment the room held its breath. Then Briggs smiled. The kind of smile that has no warmth in it, that exists only to deliver what comes next. We'll see, he said. We'll see how long she lasts when folks won't do business with you, when the bank won't extend your credit, when every door in this town closes in your face. He turned and walked out. The door slammed. The feed sacks trembled on their shelves. Silas stood very still. His heart hammered. His hands shook. The heat in his chest had nowhere to go. Henley cleared his throat. About that seed, he said. His eyes would not settle. They moved from the counter to the wall to the window to anywhere that was not Silas's face. I can't do credit. Not with... He gestured vaguely, the gesture encompassing everything and specifying nothing. Not with how things are. Silas reached into his pocket, pulled out the coins, counted them onto the counter one by one, each coin landing with a small, clear sound in the silence. $1.25. Cash. How much will that get me? Henley looked at the coins, looked at Silas. Something moved across his face, something that might have been shame if he had let it stay long enough to be recognized. 5 acres worth, he said. Maybe 6 if you stretch it thin. I'll take it. The ride home was long. Silas kept Saudi at a walk, the saddlebags heavy with seed against her flanks. The sun was directly overhead, and the heat came down like something poured from a furnace, thick and liquid and inescapable. His arm ached from gripping the reins. His shirt was soaked through. Sweat ran into his eyes, and he let it burn. He thought about Briggs's words, about the banker who had looked away when he passed, about Henley's hands sweeping the coins into the register with the efficiency of a man closing a transaction he wanted no record of. He thought about the doors that would close now, one by one, the slow quiet shutting out that small towns performed with the precision of a machine designed for exactly this purpose. And he thought about Clara, about the way she had said hours, about the way she walked through his house with her uneven step and her chin up and her hands always moving, always working, always building something from the rubble of what he had let fall apart. About the way she had cut her own petticoat into strips to save a man she had never met, and had not once, not one single time, asked him to thank her for it. The ranch came into view, smoke from the chimney, white curtains in the windows, the garden she had coaxed back from the weeds, showing green against the brown earth. It looked like a place someone lived. It looked like a place someone had decided was worth the trouble of caring about. He knew something was wrong the moment he dismounted. The air felt different, too still. The kind of stillness that settles after something has broken. He pushed open the door. Clara stood in the middle of the room. Her trunk was open on the floor. Her spare dress lay folded inside. Her brush, her Bible, her grandmother's ivory comb. The few things she owned in this world arranged with the careful precision of a woman who had packed and unpacked her life too many times to waste a single motion. She was leaving. "What are you doing?" She did not look up. Her hands kept moving, folding, arranging, tucking things into corners with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had already made a decision and was now simply executing it. "I'm leaving." The word hit him like a fence post swung at his chest. He felt the impact in his sternum, felt it radiate outward through his ribs and into his arms and down into his legs, where it settled in his knees and made them feel like they might not hold. "No." "I heard what happened in town." Her voice was flat, controlled, the voice of a woman holding herself together with nothing but willpower and the habit of endurance. "Word travels fast. Mrs. Harmon sent a boy out with a message, said you got into it with Briggs at the feed store, said the whole town's talking." "Let them talk." "I will not." Her voice cracked, a single fracture running through the surface of her composure like a crack running through ice. She stopped, pressed her hand against her mouth, held it there until the fracture sealed itself. "I will not be the reason decent folks cross the street when they see you coming. Those folks ain't decent. They're all you got." She looked at him then. Her eyes were dry, but the skin around them was raw, chafed, the evidence of tears she had already shed in private and would not shed again in front of him. He recognized that look. He wore it himself most days. "I've been here 5 weeks, Silas. 5 weeks. And I've already cost you your credit at the bank, your standing in town, whatever chance you had of rebuilding this place." She shook her head. "I'm poison to you. Can't you see that?" He stepped toward her. She stepped back. The distance between them held steady a gap she was maintaining with the same deliberate precision she used for everything else. "Don't." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Don't make this harder than it already is. Clara." His voice was rough. "Clara, listen to me. Listen to me." "I've got nothing, Silas." The words came faster now, spilling out of her like water through a broken dam. "No family, no money, no prospects. I came out here to marry a man who didn't want me, and I ended up nursing a stranger back to health, and now that stranger is losing everything because of me." She pressed her palms against her eyes. "I can't do it anymore. I can't wake up every morning knowing that my being here is destroying you." Silas stood very still. His chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with his arm or his ribs or any part of his body that could be bandaged and healed. This was the other wound, the one underneath, the one that had been there since before Clara arrived, since before the wire, since before the dust storm. The wound that Margaret's death had opened and that 2 years of silence and neglect had done nothing to close. "You saved my life," he said, "and now I'm ruining it." "No." He crossed the room, 2 strides. His hands found hers and pulled them away from her face. She resisted. He held on. Not hard, not forceful, just steady. The way you hold a rope when something precious is on the other end, and the current is trying to take it. Her eyes were red. Her face was blotched with color. She looked exhausted and ashamed and heartbroken and defiant all at once, and he thought she was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen in his life, and he did not know how to say that did not have the words for it, had never had the words for the things that mattered most. "Those people in town," he said, "they don't matter. Briggs doesn't matter. The bank doesn't matter. Then what does?" The question hung between them like a held breath. He could feel her pulse under his fingers, fast and uneven, could see the fear in her eyes, and he knew it was not fear of him, or fear of the town, or fear of poverty or hardship or any of the things that could be named and faced and overcome. It was the fear of hope, the fear of reaching for something and having it pulled away, the fear that came from a lifetime of wanting and being told in 1,000 ways, both large and small, that wanting was not something people like her were allowed to do. "Stay," he said. She did not move. "Not because you got nowhere else to go, because this is where you belong." Her lips parted. No sound came out. Just. His voice broke. He let it break. Let her hear the fracture in him that matched the fracture in her. Just don't go. Not yet. A long moment passed. The clock on the mantel ticked. The fire crackled in the stove. The curtains she had washed and ironed and hung in the window moved in a breath of air so slight it barely qualified as wind. Clara pulled her hands free. She turned back to the trunk, looked at the clothes inside neatly folded, ready for a journey she had made before and would make again if she had to. She looked at them for a long time. Then slowly, one piece at a time, she began to unpack. Silas let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. But as he watched her hang her spare dress back on its hook, as he watched her set the brush on the washstand and the Bible on the shelf, he saw something in her face that made his chest tighten all over again. She was staying. But she had not said yes. She had not said anything at all. She had simply weighed the options available to a woman with a bad leg and no money and no family in a territory that did not want her, and she had chosen the least terrible one. And Silas understood with a clarity that felt like the ground shifting beneath his feet that keeping her here was not enough. That staying was not the same as choosing to stay. That the distance between those two things was everything, and he did not yet know how to close it. The church social was on Sunday. Silas told her on Saturday night while they were sitting on the porch watching the last light bleed out of the sky like watercolor running off the edge of a page. His voice was matter of fact, the voice of a man who had already made a decision and was informing her of it the way he might inform her that the fence needed mending or the well pump needed oil. "We're going." Clara's hands stilled on the mending in her lap, a shirt of his with a torn seam along the shoulder. She had been stitching it closed with small, even strokes, her needle catching the last of the daylight. Now the needle stopped and her fingers tightened on the fabric, and she did not look up. "No. If we hide, they win. Let them win. I don't care anymore." "I do." She looked at him then, really looked. His jaw was set. His eyes were fixed on the darkening hills with the particular intensity of a man who has found something worth fighting for and is too stubborn to let the size of the fight dissuade him. He had shaved that morning, she noticed. Had trimmed his hair with the kitchen scissors, the cut uneven at the back where he could not reach, but clean, deliberate. "Silas, they want us to be ashamed. They want us to skulk around like we done something wrong." He turned to face her. The dying light caught the angles of his face, the hollows beneath his cheekbones, the lines around his eyes that were deeper than a man of 32 had any right to own. "We ain't done nothing wrong, and I won't let them make us act like we have." That night, alone in Margaret's room, Clara opened her mother's letter. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed with the cream-colored envelope in her hands, the same envelope she had carried for 2 years across Ohio, across the plains, across 1,000 miles of distance and grief. The seal cracked when she slid her thumb beneath the flap. The paper inside was a single page folded twice, the handwriting slanting to the right in the way that had always made her think her mother's words were reaching for something just beyond the edge of the page. She read it once, then again. Then a third time, slowly, her lips moving around the words without sound. Her mother had known about Margaret Holloway, had written to her through a women's letter circle, had told Margaret about Clara, about her leg, about her loneliness. And Margaret had written back, had said that her brother owned a ranch in Arizona, that he was a good man though he did not know it, that if Clara ever needed a place to go, there was a door that would open for her. The letter ended with 5 words in her mother's hand, written larger than the rest, as if she had pressed the pen harder into the paper to make sure the ink would hold. "You will know when you arrive." Clara folded the letter and held it against her chest. She sat very still in the dark room with the autumn-colored shawl around her shoulders and the smell of lavender in the wool, and the knowledge that she had not come to Arizona by accident. That 2 women from opposite ends of the country had tried to weave a thread between their families before death cut them both short, that the thread had held anyway, that she was sitting in the room of one of those women wearing her shawl, tending her brother, living in the house she had built and preserved and loved. She set the letter on the bed beside the one she had found in the root cellar. 2 letters, 2 halves of the same intention. She looked at them for a long time. Then she put them both in her apron pocket, lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed in Margaret's room staring at the ceiling where the water stain spread in its familiar unnamed shape, and the dread sat on her chest like a stone. The thought of walking into that church hall, of feeling their eyes land on her the way flies land on an open wound drawn to the damage unable to look away, of hearing the whispers that were not really whispers at all, but performances staged for her benefit cruelties dressed up in the costume of concern. She thought about turning over and pulling the blanket up and telling him in the morning that she would not go, that he could not make her, that her legs, both the good one and the bad one, belonged to her and she would decide where they carried her. But when the light came through the window and the rooster started up outside and she heard Silas moving in the main room, the creak of his cot, the scrape of his boots on the floor, she had scrubbed clean. She got up. She washed her face in the basin. She put on her blue dress, the same one she had worn the day she stepped off the train, the day everything began and ended in the space of a single heartbeat. She pinned her hair, straightened her collar, and walked into the main room. Silas was waiting. He wore a white shirt she had not seen before, pressed and clean, the fabric bright against the brown of his skin. A string tie hung from his collar, dark fabric simply knotted, old-fashioned, the kind of tie a man wore when he wanted to show respect for an occasion without calling attention to himself. "That was my father's," he said, catching her look. "Margaret saved it after he passed." They did not speak on the ride into town. Tatum had loaned them his buckboard, had insisted actually when he heard they were planning to attend, had walked the rig over himself on Saturday afternoon and tied it to the fence post and stood there with his hat in his hands and his face serious and said, "Can't have a lady riding side saddle to a church social, ain't proper." The church hall stood at the end of Main Street, white painted and plain, the steeple rising into a sky so blue it looked enameled. Wagons and horses crowded the yard. The sound of a fiddle came through the open doors bright and quick, accompanied by the murmur of dozens of voices layered on top of each other like currents in a river. Silas climbed down first. Then he turned and offered his hand. Clara took it. Her fingers trembled inside her glove, and she knew he could feel it the way she had felt his pulse through his skin on the night she had tended his fever. He did not comment. He just held on. "Ready?" he asked. "No." "Me neither." He tucked her hand into the crook of his elbow. She could feel the muscle of his forearm through the fabric of his shirt, the arm she had bandaged and cleaned and saved, the arm that had caught her when she stumbled on the porch step, the arm that was now holding her steady as they walked toward the open doors and the light and the sound and everything that waited inside. "Let's go anyway," he said. They walked through the doors together. The hall fell silent. It happened in a wave spreading outward from the entrance like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned, eyes fixed on the couple in the doorway with the sudden focused attention of an audience that has been waiting for a particular act to begin. The fiddle player stopped mid-note, his bow hovering above the strings like a breath held too long. Clara felt every gaze. They landed on her dress, her hair, her face, her leg. She could feel them cataloging her, measuring her against whatever stories they had been told, whatever judgments they had already rendered in the privacy of their kitchens and parlors and Sunday morning pews. Her limp was worse than usual. The ride had stiffened her hip, and the ache radiated down through her thigh with each step, making the dip more pronounced, more visible, more impossible to disguise as anything other than what it was. She wanted to turn around, wanted to drop Silas's arm and walk back through the doors and keep walking until the town and the people and the sound of their silence were behind her. She wanted to be small, to be invisible, to be anywhere in the world except standing in a doorway with 50 pairs of eyes watching her walk wrong. Silas's arm tightened against her hand. He did not slow down. They walked to the refreshment table. A glass pitcher of lemonade sat sweating in the heat surrounded by cups. Silas poured 2 glasses, handed one to Clara, and turned to face the room with the unhurried calm of a man who had arrived exactly where he intended to be. No one approached. Families huddled in tight clusters, their backs turned with the studied casualness of people pretending they had not noticed something they could not stop staring at. Women whispered behind fans. Men examined the floor with the kind of intense concentration usually reserved for maps and legal documents. The fiddle started up again. Tentative. A few couples drifted toward the dancing area, grateful for the excuse to move. Then Harlan Briggs pushed through the crowd. He was dressed in his Sunday best, dark suit, polished boots, his face arranged into the expression of a man who believed his own importance. His mother followed 2 steps behind her face, arranged into an expression of such concentrated disapproval that it seemed to generate its own gravitational field. "Well, well," Briggs's voice carried across the hall the way a rock carries across a window. "Look who finally showed his face, and brought his little—" "Careful now, Harlan." Silas's voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise the way a blade cuts through rope, clean and final. "Next word out of your mouth better be ma'am." Briggs stopped. His eyes narrowed. The room had gone silent again. Even the fiddle player had lowered his bow. "Or what?" "Or nothing." Silas set down his lemonade. He turned to face Briggs fully, his shoulders square, his hands open at his sides. "I ain't going to hit you, but I am going to tell every person in this room exactly what kind of man you are." He paused. "And I got a feeling they already know." A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Briggs' face darkened. "You got some nerve, Holloway, coming in here with your charity case acting like—" "Charity case." Silas's voice rose. Not to a shout. Just enough to reach every corner of the room, every ear, every person who had turned away and was now turning back. "Is that what you call her?" He took a step forward. Briggs took a step back. The geometry of it said everything the words had not yet said. This woman walked 2 miles in the Arizona heat to help a stranger she'd never met. Found me half dead on the floor of my own house, blood poisoning so bad the doctor had given up. Another step. She cleaned my wound with strips of her own petticoat, sat up 3 nights straight brewing willow bark tea and forcing it past my teeth, kept me alive when I had no reason to keep living. The hall was silent. The kind of silence that has texture that you can feel against your skin like a change in temperature. She worked without pay, without thanks, never once complained. Silas's voice was steady now, each word placed with the precision of a nail driven into hard wood. She scrubbed my floors, washed my windows, saved my garden, brought that ranch back from the dead with nothing but her 2 hands and her own sweat. He turned, slowly, his eyes moving across the room finding faces. Mrs. Briggs rigid with fury, the storekeeper who would not meet Clara's eyes, the women who had whispered, the men who had looked away. He found them all, and he held their gaze, and he did not flinch. "You call her shameful. You look at her leg and decide that's all she is." He shook his head slowly. "The only shame I see in this room is a man who judges a woman's worth by the way she walks, instead of what she does with her hands." He turned back to Briggs. His voice dropped, became almost conversational, the way a man speaks when he is no longer angry, but has arrived at something colder and more permanent than anger. "You ordered her from Ohio, Harlan, made her promises, told her you wanted a partner plain and simple, and then you took one look at her leg and left her standing on a train platform. Didn't even have the decency to say a word." He stepped closer, close enough that Briggs had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. "She's worth 10 of you, 20, and every person in this room knows it." Nobody moved. The silence held like a breath drawn and not released. Then Briggs spun on his heel and walked out. His mother followed her shoes, striking the wooden floor in sharp, rapid beats. The door slammed behind them, and the sound echoed through the hall like the report of a gun. Then footsteps crossed the floor. Mr. Tatum stopped in front of Clara. His face was weathered and kind, and he extended his hand with the simple directness of a man who had been waiting for the right moment to do the right thing. "Miss," he said. "I knew Silas's daddy. He'd be proud tonight." She took his hand. Her fingers were trembling. Behind Tatum, others approached. The schoolmistress, a thin woman with gray hair and sharp, intelligent eyes, who nodded at Clara with a small, precise gesture that contained more respect than most people could fit into a speech. The pastor's wife, a farmer Clara did not recognize, a young mother with a baby on her hip who smiled at Clara and said nothing because the smile said everything. Not many, perhaps a dozen in a room of 50, but enough. Clara looked at Silas. He was watching her, his face unreadable the way a landscape is unreadable when the light is changing too fast to fix on any single feature. "Why?" she said. Her voice came out rough, scraped, raw. "Why did you do that?" "Because it was true. Because somebody needed to say it." He paused. His jaw worked. "And because you deserve to hear it, even if you don't believe it yet." They left before the dancing started. The ride home was quiet, and the sun hung low over the desert, painting everything in shades of gold that deepened toward copper, and then toward something darker and richer that had no name. Silas pulled the buckboard to a stop at the top of the ridge. Below them the ranch spread out in the fading light, the house with its white curtains, the corral where Sadi stood drowsing, the garden showing green against the brown earth, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray line. For a long time neither of them spoke. The sun touched the rim of the western hills, and the light turned the color of old copper. Clara listened to the wind move through the scrub below them, and to the steady breathing of the mare, and to the silence between herself and the man beside her, a silence that had grown so familiar she could feel its weight the way she felt the weight of her own bones. "You talked in your sleep," she said, "when the fever was at its worst." Silas did not move. His hands stayed on the reins, his eyes stayed on the ranch below. "You talked about Margaret, about a fire." She kept her voice low, careful, the voice she had used when cleaning his wound when the work required steadiness above all else. "You said you left the door locked." The silence changed. It was no longer the comfortable silence of two people resting together. It was the silence of a man standing at the edge of something he had been backing away from for 2 years. "She didn't die of fever," Clara said. "Did she?" Silas's hands tightened on the reins until the leather creaked. A long time passed. Long enough for the sun to slip another inch below the hills. Long enough for the first star to appear in the eastern sky, faint and uncertain like a question no one had answered yet. "No," he said. The word came out flat, dead, the sound of a stone dropped into a well so deep you never hear it hit the bottom. "There was a fire 2 years ago this November." He stopped, started again. The words came slowly dragged out of him one at a time like nails pulled from hard wood. "Margaret and I had argued that afternoon. About selling the ranch. She wanted to stay. I wanted to quit. Walk away from the whole thing. I said things I shouldn't have. Mean things. The kind of things you say when you want to hurt someone because hurting them is easier than admitting they're right." He stared at the darkening hills. His jaw worked. "I rode into town and drank until I couldn't see straight. Stayed at the saloon until they threw me out. By the time I got back it was past midnight." His voice dropped. "I could see the glow from a half-mile out. The whole back of the house was burning. The kitchen. Margaret's room." Clara did not speak. She did not move. She barely breathed. "The door to her room. I had locked it from the outside before I left. Force of habit. We always locked the doors at night. Snakes, coyotes. You locked the doors." His voice cracked, not dramatically, quietly, the way a beam cracks in a house that is slowly settling into the earth. She couldn't get out. The window was too small. She was trapped in there with the fire coming through the wall. He raised his hand and looked at it, the arm Clara had bandaged for weeks. Beneath the new scar from the barbed wire, the old burn scars were visible in the fading light, smooth, shiny, the skin pulled tight across the muscle. "I went in through the kitchen. The ceiling was coming down. I got to her door, got it open." He stopped, swallowed. She was on the floor by the window. She had been trying to break the glass with a chair. The letters were scattered around her. William's letters. She'd been writing to him when the fire started. He closed his eyes. I carried her out. But it was too late. The smoke had already. She was already. He could not finish. The sentence hung in the air, incomplete, the way Margaret's life had been incomplete, the way some things can never be finished no matter how many times you go back to them. I didn't kill her, he said. His voice was barely a whisper. But she died because of me. Because I went drinking instead of staying home. Because I locked that door the way I always locked it without checking if she was inside. Because I was too much of a coward to sit in my own house with a woman who was braver than me and admit that she was right about everything. The last light faded from the sky. The stars multiplied. The ranch below them disappeared into shadow, visible only by the lamp in the window, a single point of gold in the darkness. "Did you do it on purpose?" Clara asked. "No." "Could you have known what would happen?" "No." "Then are you living, Silas? Or are you punishing yourself?" He did not answer. He did not need to. They both knew what the barbed wire had been, what the untreated wound had been, what the months of lying on the cot waiting for death had been. Not an accident followed by neglect. A sentence carried out by a man who had appointed himself judge and jury and executioner for a crime that was not a crime but felt like one every single hour of every single day. Clara reached out. Her hand found his arm. The arm she had cleaned and bandaged and watched heal. The arm with the old burn scars underneath the new wound. She did not squeeze, did not stroke. Just rested her hand there, her palm against the place where old damage met new damage, and let the warmth of her skin speak for her. They sat like that for a long time, not talking, not moving. The stars turning slowly overhead, and the wind moving through the scrub and the lamp in the window, burning steady and patient the way it burned every night, the way she had taught it to burn. Then Clara spoke. "I found the letters," Clara said. Silas went still beside her. The reins hung slack in his hands. "In the root cellar, the ones tied with the blue ribbon. I didn't read them." She paused. "But I found something else. A letter from my mother, addressed to Margaret." He turned to look at her. His face had gone pale beneath the sunburn. "My mother and your sister wrote to each other, Silas. They were part of a women's letter circle. My mother wrote to Margaret about me, about my leg, about how alone I was." Clara pulled the letter from her apron pocket, the cream-colored envelope soft with age. "Margaret wrote back. She told my mother that if I ever needed somewhere to go, her brother had a ranch in Arizona, that you were a good man, even if you didn't know it." Silas did not take the letter. He stared at it as if it were a live coal she was holding in her bare hand. "They planned this," Clara said. "Not the details, not Briggs, but the idea of it, the possibility. My mother wanted me to come here. Margaret wanted me to come here. They were trying to bring us together." Her voice caught. "But Margaret died, and my mother died, and neither of them lived long enough to see it through." She held out the letter. "My mother wrote me a letter before she passed. I carried it for 2 years without opening it. I opened it last night." Her hand was steady. Her eyes were not. "She told me to find the Holloway Ranch. She told me there was someone here who needed me. She couldn't explain everything, but she said I'd understand when I arrived." Silas took the letter. His hand was shaking. He unfolded the page and read it in the dying light, the words of a woman he had never met written to a sister he had lost about a woman who was now sitting beside him on a buckboard on a ridge in Arizona, while the stars came out one by one over a ranch they had both nearly let go of. When he finished, he folded the letter and held it against his chest with both hands. He closed his eyes. His jaw clenched and unclenched. A muscle in his throat moved as he swallowed something that could not be swallowed. When he opened his eyes, they were wet. And Clara understood that she was seeing something no one had seen in 2 years. Perhaps longer. The tears of a man who had believed he was alone in his grief and had just discovered that his dead sister was still reaching for him across the silence, still trying to take care of him, still refusing to let him go. "She knew," he said, His voice was wrecked. "Margaret knew I'd need someone after she was gone." She knew. He looked at Clara, looked at her the way he had looked at her that first morning when he woke from the fever and found her sitting beside his bed, a stranger who had chosen to stay. But this time his eyes held something different. Not suspicion, not gratitude, not the guarded wariness of a man who had learned to expect nothing from the world except what it took away. This time his eyes held recognition. The look of a man who has been searching for something without knowing he was searching and has just realized it has been sitting beside him the whole time. "I need to ask you something," he said, "and I need you to answer honest. Always. Do you want to stay because you have nowhere else to go, or because of something else?" She looked at him, looked at the ranch below them, the lamp burning in the window, the lamp she filled every morning, the wick she trimmed every night, the curtains she had washed, the garden she had saved, the porch where they sat in the evenings and listened to the coyotes and said nothing because nothing needed to be said. "I want to stay," she said, "because this is the first place in my life that felt like mine, because you never once looked at my leg and made me feel like less, because your sister and my mother decided from opposite ends of this country that we were supposed to find each other." She paused. "And because your cornbread is terrible and someone needs to teach you how to make it right." His laugh came out broken. Half laugh, half something else. A sound she had never heard from him before, ragged and raw and alive. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That's a yes." He leaned forward. His forehead touched hers. His breath was warm against her face. She could smell the soap he had used that morning and the dust from the ride, and beneath it all, something that was simply him, simply Silas, the particular scent of a man she had saved and who had, without either of them noticing, saved her back. "Thank you," he whispered. "Don't thank me yet. You ain't seen how I burn biscuits." He laughed again. This time the sound was fuller, steadier, the rust shaking loose from something that had not been used in a very long time. She wanted to hold on to that sound, wanted to press it into her memory the way she had pressed flowers into books as a girl, preserving the color and the shape and the fragile beauty of something that might not come again. "Take me home," she said. The wagon rolled forward, the wheels creaked, the mare's hooves struck the earth in a steady rhythm that matched the beating of something inside Clara's chest that she had almost forgotten she had. Below them the ranch waited, the house with its white curtains, the garden showing green in the starlight, the lamp in the window casting a golden square across the porch, Margaret's sampler on the wall, the mason jars on the shelves in the root cellar, each one labeled in a careful hand, the letters tied with blue ribbon resting in their corner, the shawl the color of autumn leaves hanging on its hook by the door, and on the table beside the lamp 2 letters lay open side by side, one from a mother in Ohio to a woman in Arizona, one from a mother in Ohio to a daughter she loved more than she could say. 2 letters written by women who did not live to see what they had planted, but who had planted it anyway, in faith, in hope, in the stubborn belief that love could cross distances that the living could not. Clara leaned against Silas's shoulder. He shifted the reins to one hand and put his arm around her, his bad arm, the arm she had cleaned and bandaged and watched heal. The arm that was still not as strong as it had been, but was strong enough for this, strong enough to hold on. The stars spread across the sky above them, thick and bright and infinite. The air smelled of sage and cooling earth, and the faint sweetness of the last tomatoes ripening in the garden. Somewhere in the dark hills a coyote called, and another answered, and the 2 voices rose together into the night and became one sound, indistinguishable, inseparable, the way 2 lives become one sound when they have finally found the harmony they were written for. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, did not know if the crops would grow, or the rain would come, or the town would ever fully open its doors. She did not know if the hard work of building a life together would break them or bind them. She did not know any of it. But she knew this. She was no longer standing on a platform watching her future drive away. She was no longer a woman nobody came for. She was going home, and home was not a place. It was the warmth of an arm around her shoulders, and the creak of wagon wheels on hard-packed earth, and the sound of a man's breathing beside her in the dark, steady alive, and hers.